Hello and welcome to this course on Introduction to the Psychology of Language. I am Ark Verma. I am a professor of psychology and cognitive science at IIT Kanpur. In this week, we are talking about various aspects of introduction to language. What are the various facets of language? What does it mean to have a language? What is language? Is a language very similar to animal communication systems? And what are the basic concepts that one needs to understand when we are setting up for a scientific study of language? So I've done that in the last 3 lectures. Today's lecture is going to focus a little bit about the story of evolution of language. I'm not really going to go into a lot of details about any of these theories that I'm going to discuss, but the idea was to kind of, at least superficially enough, present an account of where language might be coming from. I'll expose you to some of these theories. I will, in the supplementary material, provide say for example references of some of the papers that might be necessary, and you can pick up on them, and maybe let us discuss on some of the forums about these various theories that have something to say about where language is coming from. So the question that we are asking ourselves today is, where is language coming from? When did we start having language? When as a species language emerged? In the last lecture, I made a distinction between other animal communication systems and human language. We talked about the continuity hypothesis and the discontinuity hypothesis. Evidence for me favors more or less the discontinuity hypothesis. There must have been instances, things that happened in the past that qualitatively distinguished our linguistic abilities as opposed to the linguistic abilities of other species. So different scientists from different fields, psychologists, linguists, neuroscientists, anthropologists have been talking about where is language coming from, have been asking these questions about language, and the field in that sense, and because the question is also so complex, the field is so confused in that sense that this quote of Bickerton makes a lot of sense to me when he says that the evolution of language is far too vast and complex and vague a concept for anyone to say anything meaningful about it or anything sensible about it. I don't claim that I'm going to say anything sensible about it either. What I am trying to do here is present to you some of these ideas that people have given about where language might have evolved from, and obviously you can pick up from there, go and do your own reading, go and do your own search, and if possible inform us about what you think of where language is coming from. So there can be various perspectives, as I was saying, to look at where this evolution of language has happened, and consequently multiple accounts are available. Before we go to them, let us talk about some of the important biological neuroscientific developments that might have happened. Some of those are available for us to see. Say for example, the size of the human brain increased and differentiated from the brain of other apes, other species, almost around 2.3 million years ago. So that was probably one of the very significant aspects that eventually could have led us to have language. The second important development was this development of Broca's area. Broca's area is an area in the motor cortex of the brain. The motor cortex of the brain is the area of the brain that takes care of performing fine and large motor movements. Say for example, the fact that I can use my fingers in a particular way, the fact that I can use my tongue in a particular way to speak language is probably controlled by the motor cortex of the brain, more specifically this region that is referred to as the Broca's area. So the Broca's area probably was formed around up to 2 million years ago. So these two could have been the biological predecessors of how language started evolving. Physically, some of the developments also happened which would have paved the way for us to acquire speech, and this was basically something that happened as recently as 60,000 years ago, which is the lowering of the voice box, that is larynx. In the ape, the voice box is slightly on the top. You can see here in this figure, you can see that the voice box of the ape is slightly higher as compared to the voice box of the human, and the lower voice box of the human basically allows it to create that kind of airflow, to create that kind of speech that we are capable of doing. Also, smaller and flexible tongues, finer musculature of lips and mouth, all of these go a long way for us to have speech. So these developments probably happened around 60,000 years ago. So that this is probably the time wherein brain wise and physical apparatus wise we were ready to have some sort of speech, some sort of vocalizations could start and may have led to language. So this is there, but it's not really the physical aspects that people are actually really worried about. It's more the syntax, or it's more the grammar aspect that people are continuously asking questions about, that where is, where does this start from? Where did human languages, suppose say for example, or human vocalizations developed a rule based pattern so as to eventually develop into language? There are two kinds of perspectives that are possible. I am not really talking in a very exhaustive sense. Two interesting perspectives that are easy to see if you are reading material on evolution of language. One is the predominantly biological perspective that says that language is unique to the human species, it is unique to the biological and genetic makeup that we have, and in that sense the explanation of where syntax might have come from is more biologically rooted. The other interesting idea is it's basically propounded by people who believe that this whole concept of syntax is something that is predominantly sociological in nature. The societies developed, they developed different aspects of cooperation, they developed different aspects of how they talked about the world, and their way of describing the world probably led to formation of the grammars that are existing in those languages at the moment. So these are two slightly opposite views of where syntax might have come from. Let us look at them slightly closely. So from the biological perspective, there is a very interesting paper by Hauser, Chomsky and Fitch in 2002 where they talk about how evolution of language might have happened. They say, they specifically talk about two aspects. They talk about the faculty of language broad, which is basically having two organism internal features, which they say as the sensory motor system and the conceptual intentional system. They say this mediates language within the individual. So there is this sensory motor system with which we interact with the world, and a conceptual intentional system which typically governs this degree of interaction. Also this faculty of language broad includes a biological capacity to learn and master any of the languages on the face of the earth. So for example, this is something that makes us ready to acquire any language wherever we are born, whatever languages our parents speak, this is what will make us learn those language. The more important aspect is the faculty of language narrow, which is a computational system that is responsible for generating internal representations and mapping them onto the sensory motor system using the phonology. So this is something that is slightly more computational in nature and also includes this capacity of recursion. And how do we create new elements by combining earlier elements? How does this process of embedding go about? Okay, how is it that the brain can computationally handle this generation of new information, this whole concept of productivity, generativity, using this particular principle of recursion. So this is something that is very interesting, and this is something that Chomsky and colleagues feel is unique to our species. They say that faculty of language narrow, or this whole system of recursion, is something that is unique to our species, and that is probably the deciding factor of why our species has language and the other species do not. So this is one interesting point. Here in this figure you can see the faculty of language broad, which is a sort of a generic thing which has a conceptual intentional system, and then there is a sensory motor system. Say for example, thoughts and desires and what you want to talk about, probably figure out, and the knowledge that you have of the world that you want to communicate probably forms part of this conceptual intentional system, and then how do you execute that probably then happens through the sensory motor system. Okay, I am not really going into a lot of detail of these things. You might obviously catch hold of these papers, and then you will get to know in much more detail about what Chomsky, Hauser and Fitch have to say. Okay, the other idea of what or where language might have come from comes from this concept, comes from this example of Daniel Everett, Daniel Everett was an evangelical Christian who traveled to these different places to spread the word of God as it may, and he comes across this particular tribe of hunter-gatherers living in the Brazilian Amazon forests. He figures them out that that they are referred to as the Piraha, and he calls their language as Piraha language, and he lives with them for over 30 years. He documents their language, he documents their social traditions, cultures and everything, and then he writes a paper about that, and he describes the language and its characteristics. What he documents is that some of the very basic features of language as described by Chomsky and colleagues that should be there in any language are absent here. Say for example, their language does not have recursion. We've talked about this in the first lecture as well. You might go back and talk and listen to that just to revise this, but say for example, it does not have the traditional number terms kind of things. So he says that language is in that sense coming from a different place to these people. It's not really coming from biology per se, because if it were to come from biology, these people are biologically the same as other people and they should have all of those features that the other languages have. Their language probably is coming from a different place. Their language is coming from their traditions, cultures, customs, and in that sense their grammar is different, the nature of their language is different. So kind of says that this is coming more from the social anthropological customs. So grammar is probably coming from their societal practices. These are the two competing approaches. A more balanced approach was put forward by Christiansen and Kirby in 2003 paper, where they say that there are so many factors that interact with each other to bring about the evolution of language. Okay, so they say that there must be degrees of evolutionary, a biological evolution that determines some of the learning mechanisms. So how the genetic makeup etc. moves, it determines what kind of learning mechanisms will happen, and these learning mechanisms kind of move further through individual learning. So how you are going to learn, what is the information that you pick up. If you've picked up particular information, that becomes almost that gets transmitted culturally through generations and goes on and on and on, and that kind of also changes how people are acquiring language. So he says the acquisition of language or the evolution of language is a combination of individual learning, cultural transmission and biological evolution, and language kind of comes about at a juncture of all of these, as a combination of all of these. So that is again one an interesting view of how language might have come about. There are other interesting hypotheses as well. Say for example, the technological hypothesis put forward by Lana Ruck and others. They say that once humans started creating tools, when they started manufacturing stone tools, that would have kind of led to the particular changes in the motor networks, and those motor networks would have facilitated the particular movements and the particular sophistication in our vocal networks, and eventually we learned language. That is again one view of how language might have come about. Another interesting view is the mirror neuron hypothesis, that language is basically come to us by this ability that we have to imitate others' gestures. So for example, there is this system of neurons in the front of the head which are referred to as the mirror neurons, and what these mirror neurons allow us to do is that they allow us to learn by imitation. If you are doing something, I can look at that activity and I can try and replicate that activity. Maybe something happened someday, somebody created a vocalization and the other person repeated that vocalization, and then others repeated that vocalization. So it's probably happened through that chain of people learning from each other and so on. I'm not really again going into the detail of any of these hypotheses, much rather I would like you to read some of these. I've put the references here. Please read some of them, and these should give you an idea of how language evolution actually comes about. We can end this with an overview of how research on language evolution really happens, again borrowing from Christiansen and Kirby in 2003. There are these different fields that are looking at where language is coming from: articulatory physiology, archaeology, anthropology, psychology, primatology, behavioral genetics, linguistics, psycholinguistics. There are so many of these fields who are conducting their research, who are conducting their investigation on various aspects of language evolution. And if one has to really say something interesting, sensible, as Bickerton had put it, about language evolution, it can only be through a combination of these various findings, an overview that kind of combines findings across fields and then attempts to give a bird's eye view of how language might have come about. So that's all probably I had to say about evolution of language. I've not really gone into the detail of any of these theories, which was not really the point anyways, but I hope that you picked up something about evolution of language in this lecture. Thank you.